Hello, everyone. As I speak, we're a little over a month into Trump's second presidency, and he's and his sidekick Elon Musk are in the process of pretty much dismantling the U.S. government. A lot of people have been speculating as to why they're doing this. Um, I don't pretend to be able to get into the mind of sociopaths, but I have some ideas. I don't think there's one singular reason, though, why they're doing all of it. Um, but that's not what I wanted to focus on today. What I wanted to focus on today was not why they're doing it, but I wanted to push back on uh, the reason that another president like Ronald Reagan would have given for this. Um, I haven't really heard Trump give this reason, uh, though we've been hearing about this since Reagan's presidency, how government isn't a good thing, government's a bad thing. And government's ineffective, government's wasteful, government is inefficient, private sector can do things better. So, what we should do is we should shrink government. Now, Trump and Musk are definitely in the process of shrinking government right now through what looks to be essentially random, willy nilly firings of lots of government personnel and effectively shutting down various government agencies. Um, there certainly isn't much thought behind what they're doing other than they want to make government smaller, and whatever is left of government, they want it staffed with loyalists, people who are loyal to them and won't question anything they ask for. Uh, of course, this is what dictators do, but I do want to push back on what would have been an old rationale for doing something like this, which is just the inefficiency and uselessness of government. That's really not the rationale Trump is giving. His rationales have been more about, uh, things like DEI and liberals and disloyalty, and it's, I think, in Trump's mind, uh, what he's really trying to do here is weed out from government basically all of government, because he believes that it's something that just stands in his way, stands in the way of his power and authority. I think he's still probably sore from his first term when government employees actually were sort of under the radar and quietly resisting some of the things he wanted to do. And some civil servants that he saw as disloyal were getting in his way, preventing his wishes from being fulfilled. And also, I think he wants to shrink government to free up money so that he can give tax breaks to rich folks whom he sees as superior. So, one thing about Trump is he does love rich folks, and he does seem to love dictators. Now, of course, dictators tend to be very rich folks, but these are folks that Trump really likes. And so I think he just wants to make sure that there isn't enough left of the U.S. government to stand in his way or stand in the way of anything that he wants to get done. So he's just hollowing it out. Now, I'm going to push back against the wisdom of that, because for the average American, the average working person in this country, what Trump is doing is going to probably be terrible for them, for their finances, for their economic situation. And I'll go through why I believe that, but also going to be terrible for pretty much all of us, because we're going to lose vital services that the government provides. And I think ever since Reagan started dissing the government, that he was leading back in the 1980s. The Democrats have not pushed back enough on that premise, the premise that government is not the answer, government is the problem. I'm just going to say it up front. Government's not the problem. And in a lot of cases, government is the answer. The problem, if you want to identify a problem in U.S. society, the problem is unchecked power of rich individuals and corporations. That's the real problem that we have. Those are the real enemies, essentially, of the people, is the folks and the businesses that just want to accumulate more and more wealth without giving back to society, the society that actually allowed them to become rich and successful and accumulate that wealth. They want to take and they don't want to give. That's the problem. Government was actually set up, and a lot of government agencies were set up to sort of push back against that kind of power of wealth. And in a large way, our framers intended that. They realized that, we wanted a government, a democratic government, not kings and dictators. They tried to put in checks and balances into the system, but also they wanted government to act as a pushback against wealth accumulation and the power that comes with that, which can turn very wealthy individuals into essentially de facto kings, even if they don't have that title. By the way, Trump just put out a picture of himself as king on a fake magazine cover the other day. So, that's really how he envisions himself and what he wants. And he wants to get rid of any institution and anything that can push back against that, which government and government agencies actually can do. So to the extent that the enemy, the true enemy, is unchecked, unbridled wealth and people in companies exercising the power of that wealth against the average American person, the things that government does for us are good on balance. Now, I'm not saying, and I'm not going to pretend, that every single government action is a good action, that every single government agency is staffed by nothing but good people with good intentions, doing good things for the bulk of Americans, although mostly that's true. Most government workers, most of the time, are actually doing good work by the average American. They're working for the average American. And in some cases, giving up jobs in the private sector that would be more lucrative for them would give them a better income in order to do that work. So, just like when you have millions of people doing a job or involved in in an activity, some of them are obviously going to be better than others. Some of them are going to be bad because a certain percentage of all people doing all work are bad, just like a certain percentage of doctors are bad, a certain percentage of teachers are bad. And sometimes agencies of the government do get corrupted by government leaders, as is happening right now, to essentially go away from their mandate and not really work for the people. That's really what Trump wants. He wants, and must too probably, they want agencies that will work for them, not for the people. But let's talk about a little bit about government and how it actually does work for you. As a typical working person in the United States, or a typical citizen. So, first of all, a few fun facts. Government does employ millions. Directly, it employs over 4 million people. That's a lot of people. To give you an idea, if every person in the government were fired, including members of the military, the unemployment rate in the United States would go up 4 to 6%. So currently the unemployment rate's like 4%, which is historically on the low side. You fire every government worker and it goes up to 8, 9%, which is historically on the very high side. So, just directly as an employer, government, employs a lot of people directly, 3 million civilians and 1.3 million active duty military personnel. By the way, of all those 3 million civilians that the government employs, about 20% of them are employed by the Postal Service. They're postal workers. But that's a lot of people. So directly, the government employs 4.5 million people getting government paychecks. But then indirectly, there's millions more being employed by the government because the government contracts out a lot for services and goods. So what that means is the government pays private people, private sector folks, and private businesses to do some of the government's work and provide some of the government services and food and goods. And those private contractors of the government are not government employees. They just have a private contract with the government. But you're talking about a couple million more people in the private sector who get a lot of income from government contracts, including a lot of farmers. So that makes the US government America's largest single employer, both directly and indirectly through government contracts. The US government is funding about probably 6-7 million jobs in the United States. So that's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of work for a lot of people. Roughly, think of it as about directly or indirectly, the government's funding maybe 5% of the labor force of the US. So yeah, we're talking about the single biggest employer in the United States. And Trump and Elon Musk seem to want to shut it down, basically, or shut most of it down, which you're talking about throwing ultimately millions of people out of work, raising the unemployment rate very, very significantly, putting us into either a recessionary situation or a stagflationary situation. So, that's not good. But let's talk about what all those millions of people actually do. So as most of you know, the government's divided into two agencies. The government is the executive branch, which is led by the President of the United States, but the executive branch is divided up into a bunch of agencies that were established by Congress, funded by Congress, and were each agency designed to do something different but useful for the American people. So the reason for these agencies under the executive is to actually help out American people. So let's go down. I'm going to scroll down a bit here. And I'll move myself back up and shrink myself a little bit. Okay, so the US government agencies under the executive, they're mostly designed to protect US citizens from various kinds of harm, to improve our medicine, our military, our manufacturing through research that's sponsored by the government, and to provide money and health care for our citizens, particularly citizens who can't work or aren't working for one reason or another. So if you're looking to the private sector, right, Ronald Reagan, as president, was big on the government's not the answer, the government's the problem. But if you think about, do we need these kinds of protections? Do we need this kind of research? Do some people need money and access to health care who don't work? If your answer to any of those is yes, then the government's really the only provider that will work, because corporations don't have any financial incentive to do any of that. Corporations are private entities that are devoted to profit, and not bettering the lives of the average person, particularly the average person who's in hardship or who's not working or who's elderly. The companies don't have any financial incentive to help those folks. So the government's the entity that can do that. It's the only entity that can do that, the only entity that's willing to. So if you believe there's any value to doing this, to protecting citizens from various kinds of harm, to improving our lives through scientific research, to giving money and healthcare to people who need it but can't work, if you think there's value in any of that, then government's the answer. It's the only answer. There is no private sector answer to that. So I wanted to talk about some of the agencies. We've been hearing a lot of agency names recently as there are big layoffs in those agencies and some of them get shut down. And I'm going to go through a lot of them. I'm not going to go through every single agency, but I'm going to go through a lot of them because I think it's important that you know what they are, what they do, how they try to help you. Now, do they always succeed in helping you? No. Do sometimes they hurt you through misguided action? Yes. But mostly they help you, and mostly they're designed to. So USAID, which just effectively got shut down by Trump and Musk, what it funds is overseas clinics and overseas food distribution for people who are starving in other parts of the world and people who are sick in other parts of the world. And I know that foreign aid, this comes under the foreign aid category. I know foreign aid is not popular. You think about, well, couldn't we take that money and use it here for our own people? And the answer is, yeah, we could. So what's the value of helping folks who aren't Americans, who may be starving or sick? Well, one advantage to helping sick people around the world, particularly people suffering from contagious diseases, is if you treat them over there, their disease doesn't come here. So, for example, if we cure people of AIDS in Africa, because we now have medications that can effectively treat AIDS, if we cure people of AIDS in Africa, the AIDS doesn't come here because it's being treated there. And that's true of any epidemic or pandemic you can think of. Any disease we can effectively treat through clinic and medicine overseas is, a disease that we can prevent from coming back to us and causing, illness and death here in the United States. Because as we found out with COVID, diseases don't respect national borders. They don't stay put. Once a disease that has the potential to spread widely breaks out, and if there isn't a big pushback by us and effective treatments and vaccines, it's going to spread around the world and make a lot of people sick and may kill a lot of people. So one of the ideas behind USAID is it's better to treat them there before their disease comes here. And as far as starving people, other than, we have extra food that we can give them, and it's the decent thing to do to help feed people who are hungry and starving. People who are starving can do very desperate things. And when you have a whole area where people are starving, that's an area that's likely to get into conflict. There's likely to be mass migrations. And so again, the idea is if you help with that problem where it starts, you don't get the spreading issues of war and mass migration that can affect you and, friendly folks around, friendly nations around the world. So other than this being a nice humanitarian thing to do, which actually costs us very little. I mean, the entire USAID budget is less than 1% of the national budget. It's a tiny fraction of our national budget, and it does a lot of good for a lot of people. So it's good from a humanitarian standpoint for them, but it's also good for us because it prevents problems overseas from coming here. So win-win. But that agency's been shut down. So that makes it more likely that overseas contagious illnesses are going to start increasing in number. Cases are going to start increasing in number here in the United States. That's not good for us. Okay, USDA, Department of Agriculture, oversees agricultural practices, food packaging, food safety, None of us want unsafe food. There have been a lot of stories recently about how more of our food is actually becoming unsafe because it's not being properly vetted and inspected at the source. But the good news is when unsafe food does get to our shelves, because we have a USDA, we tend to find out about it pretty quickly and stop it from sickening a lot of people in the US. So that's useful. Having a safer food supply is useful. I don't think many people would argue that's a bad thing. They might argue about whether USDA goes about it in the most efficient or rightest way, but clearly that's a necessary service to help keep our food supply safe. Countries that don't have anybody to do that have a lot more foodborne illness in them. So again, this is for our protection. CFPB, which is being shut down as I speak, that's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, helps protect people from illegal financial and unethical financial practices, banking practices like charging you a fee every time you try to do something with your checking account, to fraudulent investments, to regular investment practices with overcharging of fees. And, all of us at one time or another have been a victim of financial services that either were fraudulent or were conducted in a way that was definitely not in our best interest, where we got massively overcharged on fees for doing our regular banking or regular investment stuff. So the CFPB was created after the financial meltdown in 2008 to, try to prevent financial services companies from gouging their customers, essentially. So trying to protect you as the customer of a bank or somebody who's doing small-time investing. Then there's the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, which I think most of you are familiar with, which protects us from unsafe or ineffective medicines. They require that all drugs marketed in the US be tested for safety and for effectiveness, and they require that these medicines actually do what they're supposed to do without making too many people unnecessarily ill. I mean, all medicines have potential side effects, and some of those side effects can be very bad, but what the FDA is there to ensure is that the number of people who the drug helps is greater than the number of people who it sickens. And that the sickness that some people can get from medication, the side effects, are outweighed by the effectiveness of the medicine in treating whatever disease it's meant to treat. So, we need that. We need somebody to make sure our medicines are safe and effective. It's nice to have people who are looking out for us when we do banking and investment. We need somebody to check the safety of our food supply. These are all really vital services for us, without which, think about if we didn't have these services and banks could charge whatever fee they want to, every time you do a transaction, and your food is never inspected, so it can become quite hazardous to eat. If any of you have ever been to a country that doesn't have a good, safe water supply, or good sanitation, that, eating and drinking certain types of food and liquids can be very, very risky proposition. It can make you extremely ill. So, that doesn't happen much in the US because we have this. Our drugs are safe and effective for the most part. So all these agencies are protecting us. Now, the NIH, National Institute of Health, and the NSF, National Science Foundation, are federal agencies that fund basic science research, a lot of it into more effective treatments and medications. But these agencies, the funding, the science that they fund, is designed to make sure that we here in the US have access to the best available medicine and the best available technology. That is the best that science can do for us right now. These agencies have been defunded. And so what that means practically is we're going to fall behind other countries in scientific and medical research. And it's particularly sad right now because right now we're on the verge of major breakthroughs in treatments for things like Alzheimer's and cancer. But a lot of that research is being suspended right now because of the defunding of these agencies. And so what that means is we will no longer be on the cutting edge. Eventually, other countries will get these breakthroughs and we'll have to try to borrow, beg, and pay through the nose for their technology so we can use it. So that's not good for us. The CDC, Center for Disease Control, monitors domestic and international disease outbreaks so we can be prepared. And it also funds disease prevention and disease treatment research, especially for contagious diseases like COVID, which we just had. Without the CDC, if they defund the CDC, for example, we wouldn't be able to monitor current outbreaks, and we'd be taken by surprise by future outbreaks, which we weren't tracking. So we wouldn't be prepared, and that would cause more death and illness when the disease does outbreak. Those outbreaks spread in the U.S. So again, the CDC is protecting us from infectious diseases by monitoring them and working on countermeasures and treatments. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, which gets dissed a lot, especially by businesses, protects the public from pollution, from toxic chemical release by companies. Companies that actually use toxic chemicals or generate them have a lot of incentive to just dump them, into the environment because it's cheaper for them than actually trying to neutralize them or store them safely. So the companies that, do have toxic pollution hate the EPA because the EPA monitors their releases and fines them if they release too much, etc. But protecting the average citizen from, toxic waste dumps is a good thing. There have been lots of cases in the recent past and the not so recent past of companies releasing toxic waste that poisoned water supplies that people were using and made lots of people sick, lots of children sick, caused cancers, caused birth defects, caused death. The EPA is also tasked with protecting some of our natural resources, which is the land and the stuff in nature that we need, like, say, lumber, trees. Although trees are more under the realm of the Forestry Service, the purview of the Forestry Service, but still, these are things that if you just let companies take whatever they want, strip mine the land bare, cut down all the forests, then the companies that want these resources today don't leave any for those of us who need the resources in the future, which is all of our kids and grandkids and great-grandkids. So having an agency that protects our natural resources and ensures that they don't get too badly polluted to make all of us sick is, a good thing, not a bad thing. Then we have Department of Education. Department of Education, I think, was started under Jimmy Carter in the 1970s. That's a controversial one, but one thing they do is they look for and investigate instances of discrimination in schools. Some schools are not good and they discriminate. They oversee some school evaluation programs. They administer federal student loans and financial aid programs. They don't actually generate the money for that, but they manage the money for that. It's actually Congress that comes up with the money for student loans and approves it and financial aid. But DOE oversees that, the money that's federal. It oversees the distribution, make sure it's done fairly and equitably. So Um, you can argue about this one, but there's certainly some good being done there. We've got the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, which maintain air safety. FAA trains air traffic controllers. NTSB investigates air mishaps and crashes to find out what went wrong, so we can make flying more safe. Flying is become an incredibly safe mode of transportation, even though you wouldn't expect it to be, because of the good works of the folks at the FAA and NTSB. And Trump and Musk have just fired thousands from FAA. I don't think any of you would want to fly without air traffic controllers and without a sufficient number of them making sure that planes don't run into each other when landing, when taking off, when flying through the air. These are just services we need to make our lives safer. Now, no one likes the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. That's the tax collection agency. But the truth is, the IRS mostly goes after, people always talk about, how horrible it is. The IRS makes them pay their taxes. But the IRS, when it actually does an audit, it mostly goes after rich folks. Because, let's face it, it's just not worth it to audit somebody who's making $50,000 a year. It's not even worth the time it would take an IRS auditor to go through their numbers. So, when lower income folks get hit with the IRS, it's either for something blatant, like they haven't been paying taxes at all, or it's an automated thing where the automated system has looked through the tax returns and found that some lines weren't filled in correctly or whatever. But when the IRS really does a full-on audit, it's almost always rich folks that get audited. And because when they don't pay their fair share of taxes, they're depriving other people of services because their taxes go to fund all of these other services. So no one likes the IRS, but under Biden anyway, they actually did a pretty good job of collecting a lot more revenue from rich folks that were trying to illegally avoid paying taxes. So they were helping fund the government in that way and helping reduce the national debt. Of course, we have the U.S. military, which protects us and our allies from foreign threats. These days, Trump wants our military to not protect our allies at all. He just wants it to protect us. And I suppose you can argue about whether it's useful for the U.S. to have allies that we protect militarily. But, historically, we've always felt that that's a good thing, is to have those kinds of allies. We have their back, they have ours. That's useful for countering incursions by foreign governments that are hostile to us. They'll have to think twice about, going for us if they also have to go through our allies too. Then we have the medical and payment systems for elderly and poor folks, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Medicaid gives mostly free health care to the very poor, whether they're elderly. Some of those very poor are elderly, so some elderly folks are on both Medicare and Medicaid. But some of the very poor folks are children. A lot of children their health care is provided under Medicaid, and of course poor adults who, for one reason or another, can't work or can't earn sufficient money to buy health care. And then Medicare provides the elderly, most of whom are retired and not working, with health care access that's affordable, although it does have a cost. And of course, Social Security provides retirees with basic income. The idea here is when folks get older, they eventually stop working, and so they can no longer get health care through their employer, and they no longer have an income necessarily. So Social Security and Medicare provide them with, when they're older, with access to affordable health care, and it gives them basic income so they can pay their bills. even though they're no longer working. So these are what are called entitlement systems. They're actually just a form of social welfare for giving people who can't afford it and who are not working basic income, access to health care. Now, you could imagine a system that doesn't have that. We didn't have it before the 1930s. So what happens? Well, what happened in the Great Depression is a lot of older people starved to death or died from lack of medical care. So we can go back to that, I suppose, if you want to save that money and use it a different way. But then you have a system where a lot of people don't have access to medical care, and a lot of folks, particularly the elderly, are starving to death or need to survive on the charity of their friends, relatives, or churches, which is, maybe they'll get it, maybe they won't. So it was thought that during the 1930s, when we had this Great Depression and 25% of people were out of work, 1 in every 4 Americans didn't have a job, and a lot of people who did have jobs didn't have jobs that would really pay their bills. These government payouts were seen as ways to keep people afloat when they were in a not good situation. Finally, we have like the U.S. police and spy services, the FBI and Justice Department, which is essentially the United States police force and a court, the United States courts, equivalent to state police or state courts, but this is federal. CIA, which is the U.S. spy agency, Department of Homeland Security, which is the anti-terrorist agency formed after 9/11, INS and Border Patrol, which is designed to, the INS and Border Patrol were actually designed to help people legally immigrate into the United States and get all their paperwork in order and become citizens if they were legal, and to prevent illegal crossings of the border. By the way, not just illegal individuals, people trying to cross the border so they could live here without going through the legal channels of citizenship, but also interdicting things like drugs at the border. So the crossing of illegal goods, not just illegal folks, crossing of illegal goods into the United States. So Border Patrol is tasked with, for example, not just preventing illegal immigration, but also preventing illegal import of drugs, for example. Trying to stop drug trafficking across the border, trying to stop human trafficking across the border, trying to stop trafficking in illegal pets, animals across the border. So Border Patrol isn't just about illegal immigration. Also, the INS and Border Patrol are tasked with, of course, deporting people who have entered illegally and are causing trouble here. And there we want to get into, the difference between people who've crossed illegally and you're causing trouble, they're committing crimes, doing illegal stuff in the United States, and people who crossed illegally, but they're actually behaving legally and doing useful things for us here. I think most Americans really don't have a problem with illegal immigrants doing legal work in the United States and helping us out by picking our crops or, building our homes or doing our laundry and taking care of us at home, whatever. A lot of people don't really have a problem with that. You could argue, actually, that those people give back as much to the U.S. as they take, and in some cases, a lot more. So they're a net positive for the U.S. probably. But certainly there are some folks who come here illegally and want to do bad stuff here, like deal drugs, for example. And I don't think anybody questions the activity of INS and Border Patrol and wanting to deport those folks, wanting to get those folks out of the U.S. who are here illegally and doing bad things. But looks like Trump's roundups of folks who are here illegally, while he says they're focusing on people here illegally doing bad stuff here, they seem to be sweeping up some folks who really are not doing bad stuff here and are here illegally but not causing trouble and actually providing service for us, and they want to get rid of them anyway. By the way, a lot of people who come here illegally to work legally or to work, they use the social security numbers of dead people in order to get legal jobs in the United States. Now, I think their employers probably know they're doing that. So the employers are kind of complicit, but they like the idea of having employees who are going to work hard, which most of these folks do, because they don't want to be targeted and kicked out. So they work hard, they work for less money than their legal American counterparts would in a lot of cases, and for fewer benefits. And what's interesting about folks who use dead people's social security numbers to get legal jobs in the U.S. or to get jobs in the U.S. is because they have a social security number, the employer reports their payroll to the government and they pay payroll taxes, including Medicare taxes and social security taxes, even though they will probably never be able to collect Medicare or social security. So they pay into those payment systems that we have up here, but they really don't receive the benefits from those systems. And so you can argue that they're actually giving more back to the U.S. than they're taking. They're also making goods and services cheaper for the rest of us. So economically speaking, they're probably a net positive. The illegal immigrants who come here illegally but do regular jobs and don't get into trouble and do illegal stuff here. So they are probably net positive economically for the country. So deporting them is not a good thing for us. It's actually a bad thing, economically, socially, for the United States. Now, you can argue about the FBI, the CIA, do we need them? Are they good or bad? FBI has been particularly problematic throughout the history of the U.S. in that it's one of the most heavily politicized of the groups because it is the federal police force. So there's temptation for any president to use the FBI to carry out their personal vendettas and go after their personal enemies. Richard Nixon did that. Other presidents have done it too, since the FBI was formed just after World War II. And the temptation is always there for presidents to misuse the FBI and the Justice Department as well, in selective prosecutions of their personal enemies. So there's every indication that the FBI and the Justice Department is now going to be used to go after Trump's personal enemies, and so misused away from what their real mission is supposed to be, which is finding certain types of really bad criminals in the U.S., criminals that operate across state borders, criminals that do really terrible stuff, serial killers, and criminals that go after government officials, and criminals who are government officials. These are the folks that the FBI is tasked to rein in. But if it becomes just the enforcement of Trump's personal vendettas, then it's against individuals that he feels have wronged him, then it's no longer doing its job. In which case it is a bad thing, not a good thing. So the agency itself has been turned. The CIA is our spy agency. It's obviously done a lot of morally and ethically questionable things in the spy game over the years. But CIA does try to identify foreign threats to us, including new types of threats like cyber terrorism that can be directed against folks in the U.S., citizens of the U.S. by foreign agents. In in its role as trying to identify those threats and counter them, the CIA can be pretty useful to U.S. citizens, and has been. Department of Homeland Security, of course, was developed after 9/11 to identify and counter terroristic threats to the U.S. That includes domestic and foreign terrorists. And so I think most people would say that trying to scope out potential foreign or domestic terrorist threats, and terrorist acts before they happen is a useful thing. So if you go through all of these, and I've gone through a lot of them, the truth is, if you asked individuals, do you really want to get rid of the FAA, given what it does, like train air traffic controllers? Do you really want to get rid of federal research, scientific research that can help us develop new medicines and technologies? Do you really want to get rid of the CDC, which monitors disease outbreaks, or the FDA, which makes sure our medicines are safe, or USDA, which makes sure our food supply is safe? I mean, you really want to get rid of that? Do you want to live in a country that doesn't have those things? That has unsafe, untested drugs, that has unsafe food and water, where financial companies can abuse and misuse their customers, where our environment is horribly polluted, and we get sick from toxic waste dumped into our water supply, into our air, near our homes, where we don't have anyone protecting us from terrorists, from external threats. I mean, is that the country you want to live in? Because like I said, most of these agencies, even though sometimes they can get misused, and certainly some individuals in them aren't very good at what they do, do you really want to live in a country that doesn't have any of these protections, where you are completely unprotected, where every time you take a pill, you don't know if it's going to help you or hurt you, or every time you eat your food or drink your water, you don't know if it might be contaminated, where there's toxic waste all around you, where nobody is researching better ways of doing things, better medicines, better technologies for you to use, where we have to rely basically on the good-heartedness of other nations that are still doing that research in order to provide us with cutting-edge things that we need. By the way, an agency I didn't include on here is FEMA, which helps people in disasters. Now, of course, Trump has politicized FEMA and says that it only helps Democrats and blue states, and I'm sorry, but that's just nonsense. But I'm asking you seriously, do you want to live in a country that doesn't have these protective agencies actually fulfilling their protective functions, the functions that they were designed to do? And if you're one of these people like, well, I don't need any kind of protection, I can do it all myself, fine, okay. Then the answer for you is clear. But I think most of us like these protections. And the protections have been done for so long and in such a quiet manner, I think most of us take them for granted. We just assume that things are going to be safe for us, without realizing that the reason that they're safe is because we've had these agencies in place that have been working on safety and protecting us all along. And in a lot of cases, they've been doing it for so long and they do it so quietly, we're not even aware that they're doing it. So we don't see the value. This is something that I wish Democrats would push back on more. Because I think most Democrats believe in government. They believe in the good that government can do. And government does a lot of good. Yes, not everything is good. For some things, they have not protected us as well as they should. And for other things, the agencies themselves have been, to some extent, corrupted, so that they're not doing as much good as they could. or they're not focusing their activities on serving the public good. They're more serving individuals and particular folks, and sometimes even the true enemies who are rich folks. So let's not get our enemies confused. We get into a lot of trouble when we pick the wrong enemy. When somebody who's actually a friend of ours, we choose to believe is an enemy of ours. That's when we get into real trouble, when we identify friends as enemies and enemies as friends. Then we're truly lost. And that's what Trump and Musk are trying to do. They're trying to get us to identify friends as enemies and enemies as friends. Putin is not our friend. Big banks, rich billionaires, tech bros are not our friends. Government agencies, on the other hand, when they're functioning properly and not just serving the whims of one individual, are our friends, and they have been for decades, keeping us safe. A lot of you are alive today, I could say most of you are alive today, because at one time or another, a government agency did something that kept you safe. You cannot say that about most large corporations or billionaires. Their job is not keeping you safe. Their job is extracting your wealth. Government's job is protecting you. That's what it's there for, to serve the public good. So let's not pretend that our friend is our enemy here. Government's not the enemy. Could it be done better? Yes. Could it serve you better? Sure. But it has served you well in many, many cases, most of the time. Elon Musk has not served you well most of the time. Major corporations have not served you well most of the time. Sometimes they do, but most of the time they're just in it for them, their profits, their shareholders, not your well-being. And if they could get away with it, they would hurt you in the pursuit of profits. The government's designed to help you, and it's not pursuing profits. It's doing it because it's the government, because it's your government, and it's supposed to do that. Okay? So that is my final thought here. These would-be dictators that we've got now, they want you confused. They want you thinking that your friend is your enemy. Don't buy it. The government is not your enemy. Government, when it's functioning properly, is good. And it's good for you. And it's good for your family. Okay, that's all I got for you today. Thanks for sticking around. That was a long one.